Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here and incredible to follow those two remarkable presentations by dear friends of mine who I respect deeply, and I should point out, I taught them everything they know, so I can take full credit. And I realize too, I'm the last obstacle before lunch, so I will try to make this as brief as possible. Fair warning, historian with an interpretive agenda and axe to grind here, so you'll get that. In other words, opening our minds to the Army in the Pacific, and it's a topic that I get a little bit excited about. So, fair warning on that. Now, when we look at this this map, you're looking here at 1/3 of the world's surface of ocean, continent, and island. You can't possibly win a war there and have any kind of major influence ultimately without a major army that is going to be involved in a lot of things besides just combat. And so one of the things that really occurred to me, as I studied World War II over the years, that stood out to me, is this sort of myth that I think is still very, very powerful in American memory of World War II, that the Army focused on Europe, and that when it came to the ground fighting against Japan, the Marines just did that. And the Army wasn't really involved. I've even had conversations with people who are really quite knowledgeable about World War II, like filmmakers, who do documentaries, things like that. And I've had them say, you know what, I didn't even know the Army was in the Pacific. And that just staggered me, and so that's what attracted me, in part, to this topic, because I also think beyond that, it's a way to kind of revise our understanding of the Pacific War and get our come to grips with what is a massive human story involving ultimately hundreds of thousands of Americans. So, give you a little perspective. About 1.8 million Army ground soldiers served in the war against Japan, somewhere on our map there. About 1.8 million. That's the third largest army this country has ever sent overseas to fight a war, behind only the World Wars I and II European theater armies. So that's a huge story there. And it also, when you think of the larger perspective beyond that, the Marine Corps in World War II was the largest it had ever been, about 250,000 Marines. It mobilized 6 divisions. And obviously made major contributions to the war. The Army sent 21 divisions, infantry and airborne, to fight in the war against Japan, plus regimental combat teams, engineer special brigades, tank battalions that probably amount to another 3 to 5 divisions worth of manpower. So right there, that gives you a sense of really who is more numerous and really who is going to do actually the vast majority of the fighting. Give you an example beyond that. Of course, the Marine Corps is heavily associated with amphibious operations, which it was absolutely brilliant at. The Marines in the course of World War II carried out 15 combat assaults, combat amphibious assaults. Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger's 8th Army alone in the spring of 1945 in the Philippines carried out 35. So right there, it again gives you a little bit more perspective. So who am I speaking up for? These poor schlubs, who didn't have the sort of good luck, I guess we'll call it, to fight on a really famous battlefield, sexy battlefield like Normandy or the Bulge or Market Garden or something like that. These guys from the 1st Cavalry Division fought at places like Los Negros, that no one has ever heard of, but were actually really important to the outcome of World War II. Or these poor guys who are wading through swamps, which obviously is a big part of the Pacific War experience for any Army soldier. So my purpose in pointing all this out today is absolutely 100% not to denigrate or belittle the United States Marine Corps. It's simply to kind of round out the picture appropriately and conceptually. So actually, I would argue that in pointing this out, I'm pointing out that the Marine Corps punched way above its weight and contributed massively, of course, to the outcome of World War II, but there just weren't that many Marines. And they also were able to focus primarily on combat and on lean operations, whereas the Army was handling also a lot of the logistics and the other things that were so necessary to fight a war in that part of the world. So, like what? I mean, it's just beyond belief what the Army is doing. guerrilla operations, especially in the Philippines and in other places in the Pacific. You have working with allies, obviously the Australians. The Australians, to a great extent in terms of ground operations, are carrying the load of the Pacific War in 1942 and 1943. But also, obviously, the British. The Chinese, which is one of the most significant and I would say tragic alliances in American history, and really has some sort of eerie undertones to what the Americans are to experience later in South Vietnam, with another sort of problematic ally that the Americans can't wrap their minds around, and you have some bad results that flow from some of that. So the Army is doing that. It's doing the quartermaster operations to unload ships, to get stuff where it needs to be. The transportation corps, not just trucking, but also ships. The Army has its own little mini navy in the course of this war as well. Special forces type missions where you are operating with local tribes, local fighters in places like Burma and elsewhere. The vital importance of communication, of coordination, all of this kind of stuff, and of course, oh, by the way, infantry, armor, engineer, combat operations too. Okay, and by that number, 1.8 million American soldiers, I'm not even including the Army Air Forces, which of course the Air Force was part of the Army back then. So that's just Army ground soldiers of some type or description. So the other thing too that really strikes me as I've studied this, and this kind of dovetails with a lot of with the rest of what I've covered in other books and other times, is that in spite of this being a time when unquestionably air and sea power become of primary importance in military operations and human history, and at a time when nuclear weapons come into play, all of these things that were supposed to sort of move operations away from fighting on the ground, actually, when you look at where most of the fighting and dying happened, it tended to be on the ground in World War II and ever since. About 90% of American fatalities in our modern wars, World War II through the present, have happened in ground combat of one sort or another. And that's primarily Army. Okay, so in looking at that, I think you can really get an insight into what the fighting was really like and what really decides war. So, to get a full appreciation for this, obviously you have to read my book, Fire and Fortitude. I do highly recommend that. I've heard it's good, but so I don't want to, we don't have too much time, so I don't want to go into every little battle and every nook and cranny. Let's just start with the shall we say, the lead character in this little play of ours, Douglas MacArthur. Everybody in this room knows Douglas MacArthur, and you've probably seen that famous image, and it's an image he wanted to cultivate. The sunglasses, sort of upscale sunglasses, the specially custom-made hat, the corncob pipe, and all creating this image of this sort of remarkable genius. Well, I've often said Douglas MacArthur is a man whose ego on a good day might have fit in outside the Grand Canyon. I don't know, it would have been touch and go, maybe. He was a vainglorious man in many respects, a courageous man, and certainly a high-speed strategic thinker in some respects. But his background is unique in that, unlike any other U.S. general officer in this war, he had once been chief of staff, the number one position in the Army. And the way that had played out, of course, he was chief of staff in the early 1930s. He was young. He's retiring in his mid-50s. And it's like, well, what do you do now? And so this dovetails with events that are going on in the Philippines at that point. Congress had passed what was called the Tidings-McDuffie Act, saying that the Philippines will get its independence in 1946, which meant, of course, that you've got to stand up an entire nation, including military forces. So MacArthur had accepted an invitation from his old friend Manuel Quezon, the new president of the Philippines, which had its own legislative body and its own sort of governmental structure, to come to the archipelago and basically build military forces almost out of whole cloth in tandem with the U.S. Military forces that were already stationed there. Okay, so he's doing that in the late 1930s. He's a field marshal of the Philippines, whatever that sort of meant, kind of a paper title at that point, honestly. But as events unfold, of course, World War II happens, and so he ends up as a theater commander, certainly commanding in the Philippines, but eventually his own theater called Southwest Pacific Area. And so that makes him unique among all the American theater commanders and general officers. And so the new chief of staff, George Marshall, has to deal with him a little bit differently than he does with the others. So Admittedly, when the war breaks out at the end of 1941, MacArthur's got a tough job. I mean, he's been trying to stand up these armed forces that really don't have much money and that don't have much cohesiveness. Whether anyone can really control this archipelago of 17,000 some islands, it was an open question in 1941, and it's an open question today, whether any kind of central entity can really control all that. It's multilingual, multi-ethnic, many different religious beliefs, and of course the problems of geography and lines of communication and infrastructure and all this stuff. So imagine you're MacArthur having to create a sort of National Guard-style army out of almost nothing. So we might have a platoon of 35, 40 soldiers, and we might have 6 or 7 different languages represented there, or different tribes, or different ethnic traditions, or old hatreds, or all these kinds of things. So it's a tough go, and it's especially a tough go in the late 1930s when the Congress doesn't even want to provide money to arm U.S. forces, much less the Philippines, and there's always this sort of hovering margin of concern that if you arm Filipinos, they will start to turn those weapons on the Americans who are still present in the archipelago. And this was no idle threat because, as I think many of you know, you'd had the Philippine-American War, which was a grinding, difficult counterinsurgent war, an imperial war, fought, some 35 years earlier for the U.S. to even be there as a colonial overseer. So MacArthur was up against a tough go. By the time war breaks out, this is more or less your situation here. The general sort of, to boil down the War Department's plan, it was something called War Plan Orange. And it sort of recognized the fact that there's no way you're going to be able to defend the whole coastline at Luzon and much less other islands, and that the Japanese are probably going to get ashore, but that doesn't really matter. You can retreat your army to the very good defensible Bataan Peninsula opposite Manila. You can wear them down while the United States Navy comes and fights a decisive engagement against the Imperial Japanese Navy, and then you're able to reinforce and you're able to really win this war. Well, of course, obviously Pearl Harbor, he'll dealt a blow to that. But even before that, MacArthur had sort of rejected War Plan Orange in this sense. He decides, I can stop the Japanese at the waterline. We're going to defend on the coast. I've got my Phil-American force. And so, yes, he has tens of thousands of soldiers, but many of them are ill-armed, ill-trained, ill-fed. And, it's an open question how well they're going to be able to do that kind of mission. So the other thing too is, they're combined with American forces that are hurriedly sent in there. So probably about 25% of the manpower is U.S. On the eve of war. And do you really have well-constructed bunker defenses on the beaches and all that kind of stuff? No. But as he will outline his strategy to a journalist at the time, MacArthur was a baseball fan and had once been a baseball player at West Point, and he said, my strategy is hit them where they ain't. And that's always really struck me, that quote, because that very utterance is the exact downfall of his strategy. If you're trying to defend the whole coastline, can you possibly do that with the manpower in hand and the firepower you've got? No. You're not going to be able to do that even with a really high-speed force, given the situation after Pearl Harbor, especially when the Japanese are going to have the initiative. You heard, John and Rich both point this out brilliantly about the Japanese maneuver edge and all these kinds of things that were going on in the early part of 1942. So they're probably going to get ashore. So they can hit them where you ain't. See what I mean? So this is precisely what happens, and this isn't just, well, we tried one plan and now we move on to something else. This is a catastrophe of the first order. And I would argue, and I do in Fire and Fortitude, that seldom in U.S. military history has a military campaign been so badly mismanaged by the commander and yet perceived as brilliant by Americans at home, partially because of a cult of personality, media coverage, and all this stuff. And again, fair points to MacArthur, he's up against a very tough go here, but he makes some kind of bad decisions. Why is this so catastrophic? Because the Army's logistical nodes had been spread out all over Luzon instead of concentrated in Bataan. So when you do withdraw to Bataan, so to his credit, he's like, oh, that didn't work, and so by Christmas Day, he leaves Manila as an open city, and the army is desperately trying to get to funnel down into Bataan. Great, you've improvised there. The big reason you escape is well, there's two big reasons. The Japanese are not particularly adept at quick dash offensive operations here. They're not well supplied. They're coming down with disease issues, and also Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright proves very adept at a lot of the maneuvering a lot of the ground forces back into Bataan. But the problem is you're away from your supplies now. And so this has terrible, terrible consequences. By the time the army gets to Bataan in early January 1942, the supply situation is almost hopeless. MacArthur's quartermaster estimated that now the army has the following on hand: 30 days of rations, 50 days of canned meat or fish, 40 days of canned milk, 30 days of flour, 30 days of canned beans and tomatoes, 20 days of rice. You've also had the added disaster of losing most of your air power, some of it on the ground, quickly after the onset of hostilities, and there's a whole sort of web of errors and miscommunications that have led to that. But I would argue MacArthur's the commander, so ultimately he probably takes the most responsibility, though he's not entirely at fault. But this cedes the initiative to the Japanese, of course, and allows them, in tandem with what had happened at Pearl Harbor, that it's going to take the Navy a while to recover and become a presence in this area. And the fact that the so-called Asiatic fleet under Admiral Tommy Hart doesn't pack that much of a punch yet compared to the Japanese, in tandem with all that, now you're really in some trouble. You're not going to be able to resupply. So you might ask, well, when you get to Bataan, are there local food sources? They try that. The army was slaughtering 30 to 40 animals per day in a kind of improvised abattoir. But that was giving you about 6 ounces of meat per man, roughly. Only about that. And it was going to decline from there because the Japanese air attacks put an end to fishing. That was another thing they were thinking of doing and tried, but there's just too many Japanese planes that are suppressing that. Plus, the local population of Bataan still had to eat, and so you've got that issue too. So you've got an army of about 70 to 85,000 guys packed into that peninsula in tandem with the local population. You've got just a completely compromised logistical situation. But I should also point out, the army there is not really tactically defeated on the battlefield. In a lot of the sort of small unit operations, when you look at them closely, the Japanese don't fare all that well. The Americans will inflict heavy casualties on the Japanese. They're going to stave off low-level amphibious invasions that the Japanese will try to do to outflank the Allied defensive line at Bataan. They're going to annihilate at least one Japanese held perimeter, and it's here where you see the Japanese propensity to fight to the death. You see it here too. So it's an army that's compromised by its stomach, not necessarily on the battlefield, because most of what you're doing as a Phil-American soldier in any given day is just searching for food. And trying for food. You're on probably about half rations and then eventually quarter rations, and then you've got tropical diseases that are setting in, obviously because you're diminished, and this is just a really tough situation. MacArthur will disingenuously send out this message to his command: thousands of troops and hundreds of planes are being dispatched. The exact time of arrival is unknown, as they will have to fight their way through. It's imperative that our troops hold until these reinforcements arrive. Well, this was completely fatuous, but I will say in his defense, he was getting that kind of communication from Washington. But he probably knows better, so why pass that on, and get their hopes up? So that's partly what accounts for the bitterness of many of the soldiers on Bataan who felt abandoned. They will feel abandoned to the Europe First policy and things like that. And MacArthur will never forgive Washington for that, of saying, well, why didn't you help us, Americans, there when you're sending stuff to the Soviet Union in January, February, March 1942? Why not help us? So, he's on Corregidor, which of course is in the middle of Manila Bay. And, in spite of the fact that many of his soldiers on Bataan are sort of cursing his name and calling him Dugout Doug, which is profoundly unfair, because he's extraordinarily courageous. He will lose 25 pounds during his time on Corregidor. He will expose himself to fire many, many times, but he did not visit Bataan very often. I think maybe twice at the most that we can really document. And even those were not necessarily frontline visits. So if you were one of those guys on Bataan, you didn't really see him, so you perceived him as this sort of aloof figure. who didn't necessarily care, but he did. Of course he did deeply. But there's another factor in this that I think has tended to be overlooked or glossed over, and it really is jarring, especially when you stack it up against a lot of the rest of modern U.S. military history. MacArthur has his young wife and toddler son with him in Corregidor. In May 1941, the War Department had sent an order to American military forces in the Philippines because, war seemed to be imminent, and they had ordered all dependents out of the archipelago. Everyone had complied with that order except who? MacArthur. Now, there's a sort of little loophole to this. He hadn't technically been called to active duty yet, but he was later. So why wouldn't he comply with an order that was still in effect? So certainly that's going to impact something of his emotional mindset, his thinking. You've got a toddler in a war zone getting bombarded, living in the Malinta Tunnel, and his wife too. And so there was a lot of concern in DC and also in MacArthur's command. What's going to happen if the Japanese capture them? What will they do to Gene MacArthur? What will they do to Arthur MacArthur? And of course, by then too, by February, March 1942, as this garrison for any sort of jaded-eyed person was probably doomed, FDR orders them out. Whether you could get them out is another matter, but orders them out. So this is something, MacArthur will eventually do in a clandestine operation with PT boats and B-17s that take him to Australia, and you all know that he goes to Australia and says, I shall return, and, he will argue, again, I would think fatuously, I only went there because I thought there was going to be a lot of reinforcements and I was going to come right back a few weeks later and all this. It's like, well, come on, was that really in the offing? I'm skeptical, at least. But, so yes, he does leave, but you can imagine the quandary that he's in. He cares deeply for his troops. Never doubt that. He's been ordered by his commander-in-chief to abandon them, essentially, which is quite a dishonorable thing in a way. But it's the order. Do you follow that order or not? And he had temporized, but ultimately, as you know, he does follow the order. He takes key members of his staff with him, and they will eventually be known as the Bataan gang. I've never really understood that because they spent most of their time at Corregidor, not Bataan. So if I were at Bataan, I would kind of resent that personally. But yes, that's what he does, and and he's going to form that whole theater that I had mentioned called the Southwest Pacific Area. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General Wainwright succeeds MacArthur, and then has to deal with this mess that's in the offing in the Philippines. Troops are fighting really hard. But as I mentioned, logistically, they're absolutely doomed. Bataan, the force of Bataan surrenders like April 9th and 10th, 1942. It's an ironic date because it dovetails almost exactly with the surrender of Lee's command in 1865. And the commander on Bataan was Major General Edward Ned King, who himself was a Southerner who'd been reared in the history of the Civil War, had forebears who were in the Civil War, and all he was thinking as he went to surrender was that sort of an amalgamation, that terrible thing, General Lee, then I shall go see General Grant, I'd rather die 1,000 deaths. And so King is like thinking that in his mind as he goes there. Other interesting thing about King, unlike many white Southerners at the time, he believes in racial equality, and that was one of the first briefings he would give his newly arrived United States Army officers, say there's no such thing as racial superiority, you better learn to deal with the Filipinos as equals, that's how we operate in this army. King endures terrible captivity, of course for years, but does survive. Wainwright holds out on Corregidor for about another month when they surrender on May 6th after a Japanese invasion of Corregidor. So you end up, as we heard earlier, with tens of thousands of Allied soldiers captured, most of whom are Filipino. Okay? About 21,000 of those captured at Bataan and Corregidor were U.S., and the vast majority were Army. You have some Marines in the luckless 4th Marine Regiment that had been sent in to fight at Corregidor. You have some naval personnel, Army Air Forces, but the vast majority are Army Ground Forces. And then, of course, you have the infamous Bataan Death March. So I just want to put a face on it for you. Fascinating to look at the POW experience through the experience of this guy, Major and then Lieutenant Colonel Harold K. Johnson. Now you're looking at him later as a general. He was United States Military Academy 1933, He's a commander and a staff officer within the 57th Infantry of the Philippine Division, which is the Philippine Scouts. These are professional soldiers, Filipinos, who then have like U.S. NCOs and U.S. officers who are mentoring and commanding some of these units. So Johnson was a key player in the 57th Infantry. He had kind of held it together, and he's captured at Bataan along with, of course, thousands of others. So what does he endure? Privation, thirst, hunger, low morale, misery, neglect, chaos, sunning out treatments that the Japanese do, forcing them to sit in the sun. And you can imagine how dehydrated these guys are. If you make a move for a water well nearby, they might shoot you or club you to death or whatever. Just horrendous, the exhaustion of it. The other thing about the Bataan Death March, the Japanese are not in any way prepared to deal with tens of thousands of POWs, but not just that. Tens of thousands of POWs who are in the kind of terrible condition these guys are in. A 60-mile march for soldiers under pretty normal circumstances, if they're reasonably healthy, is very doable. But these guys are malnourished, they have beriberi and other tropical diseases, malaria, so that's a tough go for them. So as this nightmare unfolds for Johnson and the others, he's thinking constantly of his wife Dorothy, with whom he had a very strong bond, and interesting thing too is he thinks of her and he thinks of this sort of larger world of leadership that he's been part of, and the responsibility of leadership as he's thought of it from West Point forward. To him, it brings out the best. The Bataan Death March and the captivity brought out the worst in a lot of people. That's one of the really ugly secrets of this whole thing, and the Japanese kind of wanted it that way. They wanted to take the leaders away and just say, you're all on your own, sort of a Lord of the Flies environment as we would think of it later. I mean, just anarchy. Johnson is one of the people who that situation brings out the ethical side. And so he's equating ethics to life and survival and saying, this is how we must operate together to love one another and to look out for one another. That's really hard to do in that kind of situation. So you really see some insights into who this guy really is. The selflessness, the professionalism. Leadership wasn't about glory to Johnson. So as conditions grew worse, he became even more ethical. He's very spiritual too. He said God was very close and very real in those hours. The march claimed the lives of about 600 Americans, but between 5,000 and 10,000 Filipinos. If you survive that, as Johnson did, you're consigned to what was called Camp O'Donnell, a true hellhole, absolute hellhole of a POW camp, and that's even nice to call it that. For over 2 months, Allied soldiers died in droves, hundreds per day. Disease, thirst, starvation, the occasional arbitrary execution or beating. You subsisted on rice gruel. Most of you spent a lot of your day just waiting in a water line. Most of these guys are terribly dehydrated. Chaos reigned, little leadership. In the Zero Ward, this is really troubling, but men died in their own excreta. Death was easier than life, one prisoner later reflected. It was as easy as letting go of a rope, and a lot of people quit hanging on. So Johnson had survived the death march, but he fell prey to malnutrition and a terrible case of dysentery, which of course could be fatal, and often was. He went into what was called the Zero Ward, which meant a part of this terrible camp that you had zero chance to survive in. Somehow he lived. As he put it, I don't know why, I just know I came out. Many others were less fortunate. 1,547 Americans died at O'Donnell in that 2-month period, between 21 and 26,000 Filipinos. So the Filipinos really had it much worse. The Americans, 1 in 6 fatality ratio, the Filipinos about 1 in 3. The survivors went to a POW camp called Cabanatuan, where high death rates persisted through much of the year, but through Johnson's leadership and others, there started to be improvement. He runs a commissary. He's by acclamation sort of nominated to run this commissary because he's so honest. Because it was easy to exploit, especially for officers, to use that to exploit other people, and he refused to do that. He creates a kind of charitable system where people would donate their money, and you would be able to purchase things from Filipinos on the outside to help prisoners survive. He kept an illicit diary that he kept in the form of a long letter to his wife, Dorothy, and he wrote, "My commissary is thriving. My commissary business is booming," excuse me. So, he slowly, he and the others are helping the conditions get better. So by 1943, it's somewhat stabilized, but it's still not a good place to be. And there were many, many, of course, terrible challenges that he had ahead, he and the other POWs, in order to survive. As you probably know, 37% of those who became POWs did not survive. So Back to our big map there. So how are we going to turn the tables on the Japanese? Well, of course, you have by now the Southwest Pacific area, which you see on the map there in Australia, New Guinea, some of the Solomon Islands that are going to be under MacArthur's command. He has then kind of split. There's been this uneasy compromise between Navy and Army. Chester Nimitz will control much of the rest of our map, obviously. But, from a naval point of view, you look at that map, you say, well, of course it's a Navy's war. And you're not going anywhere without the Navy. And sea power is incredibly important, and so is air power. But in the end, you have to control ground. Okay? And that's where this army of 1.8 million Americans comes into play for us. That's who's controlling ground for you, more often as not. And one of the first places you're going to see that is MacArthur's attempt at a counteroffensive in New Guinea, in Papua New Guinea. I'm really glad John and Rich were able to talk about what was going on in the South Pacific and show you those maps, and it was just tremendous stuff. So I don't really need to repeat that. You have a very good sense of this. But what I would point out, maybe to round out the picture even more of Guadalcanal, is that the Battle of Guadalcanal, and you can see right where it is on the map there, smack dab in the middle, and what happens at Buna in New Guinea, and Papua New Guinea, are two battles of the same campaign, especially from a Japanese point of view. And that's one of the reasons why the Japanese lose. They're going to be spreading resources between the two places too thin, and this is to the advantage of the Allies. So we as Americans tend to think of Guadalcanal and Buna as completely different animals because they were in different commands. Halsey's command versus MacArthur's, and MacArthur, of course, sucks the oxygen out of any room, right? And so, he's not always that big on cooperating with the Navy at this point and all that. So, so this is why I think in hindsight, we tend to kind of gloss over that reality, and that's a big reason why the Japanese lose. So, MacArthur's concept is as you see, Buna, Jirua, Gona, all these other places on the North Coast have become key Japanese bases that they're holding on. They had made a push for Port Moresby in the south, a possibility of an invasion of Australia and all this kind of stuff. That had been foiled earlier in 1942. It was another sort of turning point, and the Australians were really the masterminds of that, but also New Guinea itself, just operating in that horrible place, So that had foiled the Japanese. We're talking like July to September. The Japanese, as the map shows you, had an expeditionary force that went all the way from the north coast to almost the south coast in the midsection of 1942. And they had gotten as close to Port Moresby, that key Allied base, as to see some of the searchlights and the anti-aircraft units that were in the perimeter there. And then you're told, after enduring this hell in this wilderness for weeks and weeks and seeing a lot of your comrades die, I'm sorry, we can't press on and take Port Moresby. We're going to have to turn around. When the Japanese officers get that order, some of them don't want to follow that order. You can understand why. It's profoundly dispiriting for them. And I really think it's eerily similar to those famous German patrols that get within sight of the Kremlin in Moscow, in the fall of 1941, and then are turned back, This is another one of those sort of pressure points of World War II. So what the Japanese are trying to do by what we would call the fall, but it's really the spring, it's southern hemisphere, what they're trying to do is hold on to those bases on the north coast while they wrap things up at Guadalcanal and then maybe make another push for Port Moresby. And of course the other subplot to this is the Battle of Coral Sea and all that happened in May 1942 that I won't go into. But so MacArthur's concern is that that'll happen and he'll get turned back again and he'll lose again. So what he wants to eliminate those North Coast bases as soon as he can. And he's got a weapon that the Japanese don't have, which is airlift capacity. His commander, Lieutenant General George Kennedy of the 5th Air Force, has really spearheaded that. And so that allows you to move people on planes in 45 minutes, what could take you weeks and weeks of horrible wilderness struggle to get through. So the 32nd Infantry Division, in tandem with the Australians, is going to be given that job of securing those bases in the north. And it's not going well by the end of November. It's a total mess. The coordination is poor. The supply situation is poor. The 32nd Division is a National Guard division. I love this. This is so Army. It's from Wisconsin, Michigan, and northern Illinois. Very cold weather places. By all means, let's send it to the South Pacific, right? Square peg into the round hole. But, you know, that's just the crises of the war that they're dealing with. So these guys were well trained, but they weren't prepared to exist in that kind of environment with very little artillery support, not much naval support, not much airstrikes, and that kind of thing that you're going to have later on, you're going to take for granted. But it's an infantryman's fight in swamps. I mean, that's what Buna had become by the end of November and early December 1942. So you're talking about any movable land or path is going to be heavily covered by coconut-reinforced Japanese pillboxes. Any route of movement is covered that way, and you're going to get slaughtered. Moving through the swamps, you can imagine what a nightmare that is. So it ends up as a crisis point, and MacArthur turns to the guy who's going to be, I would argue, his most effective ground commander in the war, but certainly sort of his fireman. The guy you see right there in the middle, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger. And, he famously sends him in there as a corps commander in charge of this whole perimeter now. And he says to him, take Buna, Bob, or don't come back alive. Imagine if your boss did that. Do this job today, or don't come back alive. That's what he's telling Eichelberger. They'd known each other for a pretty long time. Eichelberger, fascinating background that I won't get too deep into, but the highlight of it is he was a son of a Civil War veteran on the Union side from Ohio, a very prosperous lawyer and gentleman farmer so he had a very good boyhood and comfortable background, but the wrinkle was that he had 4 other siblings, all of whom were older. And Eichelberger's father had come to believe, like many parents do, oh, my kids are soft, they'll never really, thrive the way I can, so I'm going to have to just test them constantly and push them. So life was like a reality show at the Eichelberger house of pitting competition against one another. And imagine if you're the youngest, you're the baby, and, you're just not able to keep up. So he wasn't taken very seriously. And this kind of leads to this sort of chip on his shoulder for him throughout much of his life of, I'll show you, and so it's a kind of powerful push to be an achiever, very sensitive to slights and that kind of thing, but charming, garrulous, nice, great sense of humor. Eichelberger had really no enemies in the Army. He had gone to West Point, graduated in the class of 1909, and finds really his mission as a soldier. So he had served in Siberia during World War I as part of the polar bear expedition to try and snuff out the Bolshevik regime there. And he had served very courageously. He was an intel officer. He had studied the Japanese, who were part of that too. And, so he had worked under MacArthur when MacArthur was chief of staff, so MacArthur knew him well. And he gets the job of going in and cleaning up the Buna mess. Well, before he goes in, he writes to his wife, Emma, and they were very powerful soulmates, and happily enough for a historian, he wrote to her like 2-3 times a day, and just these incredible, descriptive, soul-searching kind of letters, in addition to a diary and all this kind of stuff. And he tells her, you may be sure I shall always be with you in my thoughts. As I think of all the years we've been together, I know you must realize how my admiration, respect, and love have increased. So there he goes to Buna. And he finds that sort of terrible situation I mentioned, filthy, fever-ridden, practically starved, living in the tidal swamp. One officer described the troops. And the other thing that's really awkward about it, especially for Eichelberger, who's so genial and nice, the 32nd Division is commanded by an old friend of his, a classmate, Forrest Harding. Okay, so what are you going to do about that? He wants to keep Harding's job and keep him in place. Harding, though, had never really visited the front. And this was inexcusable to Eichelberger, who's very much a lead from the front kind of guy. And so as this thing plays out, he finally has to recommend his relief, and Harding never forgave him for that. It split the class of 1909 to some extent for the rest of their lives. Very awkward situation, but probably necessary. So what he figures out, and this is where I'll sort of conclude with this, because I want to leave time for questions. What he figures out is, yeah, MacArthur's pushing me for a quick resolution, like an all-out attack. He tries that once, but it's the same thing as before. So he's like, no, we're going to have to dig in for a long haul and just sort of death by 1,000 cuts. And so the map is busy, but it shows you all these sort of small unit actions, many of which he's leading personally, as like a veritable squad leader. Imagine that. And he's very lucky to survive. He loses about 30 pounds in 1 month, in which you're just sort of eroding against the Japanese power. And as Guadalcanal happens, the Japanese aren't able to reinforce here. So you're a Japanese soldier here, and you're like when's the help coming? And so there's a lot of really quite moving diaries that have survived from the Japanese soldiers at Buna. Here's just some excerpts I'll tell you. This is Sergeant Kiyoshi Wada. He writes, "What a discouraging and miserable state of affairs. Trees have fallen, limbs have been cracked, and the hospital's in a horrible plight. What is going to happen to us?" Another one wrote, "Every day my comrades die one by one and our provisions disappear." Many penned farewell letters to loved ones, most of which, of course, didn't get through, but were captured then by the Allies. This one, I think, is really poignant. He said, "I would like to write a few lines before I die." This man is writing to his wife. "You have a fine soul, one that's rare in this world. By chance you married unworthy me. You devoted yourself faithfully to me, and I'll always be grateful. But your devotion will have been in vain, as I will soon die for our country." Just sort of matter-of-factly, I will soon die for our country. And undoubtedly he did. So by January 3rd, the fighting came to an end with basically the annihilation of the Japanese garrison, as the 32nd Division has just become a kind of a brand new unit in some ways, in part because of Eichelberger, but really because of the soldiers and what they're doing. And they're just fighting all these terribly degraded Japanese corpses throughout the remnants of this perimeter. So this is, massively overlooked, the first American ground victory of World War II. And Eichelberger is the sort of mastermind of that. So what eventuates from that, beyond that, of course, is more of this, you've started to buy New Guinea in a way, right? So you're going to be there about the next year plus, and it's not going to be easy. Disease is going to be a serious problem. There's just one thing I'll tell you. By 1943, the Americans are losing 5 soldiers to malaria alone for every 1 they're losing in combat against the Japanese. So you're going to have to deal with that in the long run, and obviously the logistical issues. But you've started to turn the tide in tandem with all these other battles and situations we've heard about. And the U.S. Army you're seeing it by the 1942, evolving from this kind of provincial force into a major world-leading army of tremendous complexity with very adept leadership and enormous logistical know-how behind it, and enormous fighting resolve. Because, John had talked earlier about the Eastern Front determinist thesis, and I couldn't agree more, but there's another element I would add to this, that it is human will that decides the outcome of wars. And human will often plays out in whether I'm willing to go forward in the Buna swamp or not. Whether we have soldiers who are willing and able and trained and properly led to do that. And that is no sure thing. And it's one of the reasons why the Allies win. They will eventually have at least enough people willing to do that manifests their society that has sent them there to fight this war. So I would argue by the end of 1942, when the Army is sort of evolving in this way, it has determined and showed its fire and fortitude. So that's why I've come up with the title. Thank you. I appreciate your attention. Love to take some questions if there's time. Thanks.
Thank you. That was great. In U.S. Army lore, what is the Army's proudest moment in the Pacific War?
Wow. You know what? What's the Army's proudest moment of the Pacific War? You know what? It could be the liberation of many of those same POWs I was just talking about today. Because some of them were still in the Philippines when MacArthur's forces came back in 1944 and 45. And so in the early months of 1945, you see the liberation of some of them at Cabanatuan, at Bilibid, and you see the liberation of Allied civilians at an internment camp called Los Baños. If you were part of that, as a United States Army Ranger or part of the 1st Cavalry Division, you would never forget it. You would be very proud of it to this day. If we're looking beyond just the sort of human lens, I don't think there's any question that when you're talking about a massive invasion of Leyte in October 1944, 4 divisions and plus many, many more in reserve, the ability to pull that off is remarkable. And of course, Lingayen Gulf at Luzon in 1945 is much the same thing. And there's more amphibious divisions devoted to those invasions than the U.S. contribution to the invasion of Normandy. So it gives you some sense of that, and I think more naval hardware too, because at Normandy you have the other Allied navies that are doing a lot of the heavy lifting there. Yeah, good question. Others? Virtual?
All right, this is from Ethan. He has a two-part question. The first question is, what is the name of the U.S. commander who encouraged U.S. soldiers to avoid discriminating against Filipino soldiers?
Major General Edward Ned King, who is the U.S. Or Allied commander at Bataan, who surrenders in April 1942. Yeah, and he was a Southerner too, by the way.
And along those same notes, can you give some other examples of the opening up of the Army to a less segregated and more equitable view of service by people of color in this period?
Yeah, well, I wish that were true. That's really one of the seamy and darker sides of this, is that the Army, like the other armed forces, is segregated. And hardcore segregated. And so, like a lot of the unglamorous jobs of logistics that I was talking about, like the port companies and all that have to unload the ships and are just working around the clock, many of them were African American. And it is just, not treated well, not led particularly well. Many of the engineers who will build the famous Burma Road that opens up the landline into China, about 2/3 of them were African American. The 93rd Infantry Division is sent into to an island called Bougainville. This is in 1944, so it's a little ahead of the time we're talking about. But there had been ferocious fighting there as the Japanese, in an ill-fated offensive, tried to eliminate an army, an almost entirely army-held perimeter in March 1944. The 93rd is sent in there to get its feet wet like any other combat unit, but they're not any other combat unit because they are buffeted between these two really ferociously competing political blocs in America, the hardcore segregationist Jim Crow side, which is prevalent, and the civil rights, which wants change. And so this group over here, any slip up that the 93rd has, there you see African Americans can't fight, blah, 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 all this nonsense. And so then that would then justify further Jim Crowism. The civil rights folks, any patrol that's successful, all of a sudden that's like, taking Omaha Beach or something, So it's very hard to look at it through an objective lens, but the sad thing is when they, like almost any other combat unit, has a rough patrol where things go wrong and there's some bad leadership, and this is seized upon, at least bureaucratically and otherwise, to justify continuing the segregation and sort of backbenching African American soldiers. So there were, by the way, too, as long as we're talking about it, there were serious race riots in Australia among American military personnel between whites and blacks. So this is really one of the sad ironies of the whole war. You're fighting against these homicidally racist regimes. You're doing it with segregated armed forces. The other thing, too, in terms of race, a lot of Army soldiers are going to have to come to terms with saying, well, wait a minute, I need to think beyond my own whiteness here in fighting alongside Burmese, in working with Indians, in working with Chinese, in working with people from South Pacific Islands. One of the reasons why the Allies prevail in Papua New Guinea is they treat the locals better than did the Japanese. And so it's true, some of them will be sort of exploited in a labor sense, but at the same time, they're getting paid, they're having, the Allies at least have some conscience about paying people and treating them reasonably well, though also, too, we should recognize, from their standpoint, here come these outsiders bringing war to your home, and how bewildering that was. So I think a lot of Army soldiers, among whites especially, really will start to kind of revise their racial views as they advance throughout the Pacific. It's one of the reasons that, and also seeing the treatment of African Americans, it's one of the reasons why you're going to see a powerful civil rights movement come out of World War II. Yeah. Anything else? I can't see it. Sorry.
Yeah, so obviously the Army here is fighting protracted jungle combat in the 40s, and of course we're going to see that again 20 to 30 years later.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you might comment about any doctrinal lessons that maybe are formed in World War II that then the Army carries forward.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I found this incredible letter written by a guy who was a general as of Vietnam, but like a battalion commander in World War II. And he's writing in like 1965 or 66, and he's saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're doing this all over again. This is exactly like World War II in the Pacific with the jungle war and all the logistical challenges, all this kind of stuff. And he's quoting it, chapter and verse. But what really stands out to me is not only that pattern you see, but also the Americans continuing with their jungle tactics defensively. And what I mean by that is the prevailing notion, until I would argue the night vision era, is it's nighttime, so we stop fighting, we hunker down in our bunkers and our foxholes, and we shoot anything that moves outside of our foxhole. There's very few thinkers in the U.S. Army in World War II, and I would argue even through Vietnam, who are saying, no, why don't we own the night? Why aren't we out there fighting and doing precisely what the Japanese are doing with these infiltrations and all that? So if there's tendencies, in a way, it's sort of doctrinal side, unfortunately it's that, but also the things you'd expect. The combined arms, the use of massive firepower. The Americans are so far beyond the Japanese by 1944 in the use of combined arms and firepower and all that. That's that they are way beyond. The last thing I point out, the jungle side of this war starts to ebb away as you go farther north, in which now caves become the sort of key determining terrain. So at this point that we're talking about, 42 and 43, yeah, it's jungle war and everything that means. It's just a green desert. As you go farther north, the dynamic is a little bit different. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.